So we're in chapter 18, section 4, and we're going to be talking about amphibians. Amphibians, the word meaning double life, which means they live in both land and water. They come from the class name amphibia, means on both sides. And if you know about the frogs, of course, frogs spend the first part of their life almost like a total different creature, like a tadpole swimming around, and then finally turning into this adult type bullfrog or adult type frog or salamander. So as you can see, their characteristics are very diverse, and we're going to be looking into there. Let's go on to this table on the next page, and we'll come back to here. There we go. Here we go, the group of amphibians that you need to know. So the group, we have anurons, which are frogs and toads from the order Anura or Salentia, and they're tailless leaping amphibians in this group, which consist, of course, of bullfrogs, tree frogs, and American toads. There's 5,400 different species of those. And then the next group we have is salamanders, and they're under the order Caudata or Urodela. And these are amphibians with elongated bodies, not like frogs. They have elongated bodies and tails. They have short legs and soft, moist skin, these salamanders. There's 550 species of those. And of course, we have the giant salamander, mud puppy, Oxolotl, and onto the newts. So, and then the last is very unique, known by their scientific names only, which are kind of hard to pronounce sometimes, but we have the caecilians, and under the order Gymnophiona or Gymnophiona, and onto Apata or Apata. So these things, they look like snakes. They're slender, burrowing, worm-like, legless amphibians. So they're in the amphibian family because of their texture and because of some of other attributes, but they don't have legs. So a lot of people think they are snakes. But anyway, there's 170 different species of those. So let's go back and we're going to go over what an amphibian actually is and why we put these in the class of amphibians. Here we have anurines, which are the frogs, but let's talk about all of the amphibians. I'm going to focus in here. We'll focus on the frogs a little bit here, but as part of the amphibians. But of course, we have salamanders too. But anyway, in this class, the characteristics are very diverse. It comes from a frog that's a Cuban frog, which is called a pedophorin or pedophorin, as I used to pronounce it, pedophorin, and that is this little tiny Cuban frog, to the Chinese and Japanese salamanders that are over 5 feet long. In fact, the Chinese being 5'9" long salamanders. So that's as long as 5 foot is like as tall as a person, 5'9", taller than us, taller than me. So that's a salamander, a huge salamander. So the thing about this category, they're usually fused, their head and their elongated neck. So you can see, especially with a frog, they don't really have this elongated trunk. They really don't have an elongated neck. Sorry about that, but they have this elongated, this part, and then of course the neck is fused. The fused is fused to the neck. So there isn't a neck. They're oviparous, which means they lay eggs. Their eggs lack shell. They're all in water only. So they lay their eggs in the water. And they lay eggs then as they come out of their eggs, they hatch, they go into the larva stage. And the larva stage, they breathe by gills. And they're the aquatic stage there. And the adults gradually lose their gills and develop into lungs, and they develop into a whole frog from this little larva. They have scaleless skin here, as you can see, no scales, and very thin and porous. Their skin is susceptible to drying out. And so, of course, when you talk about the metamorphosis, I talk about the metamorphosis between the larva state and the adult state, and which is very known. That's the word amphibian, meaning in both sides. They live mainly in fresh water. There's no frogs in the sea, in the salt sea. They don't like salt. But they're actually, there's a few different species that live in brackish water. That's the water that's part fresh and part salt. Terrestrials, well, salamanders and toads live on the land mainly, but they also emerge from the water. So they all have to have some water in their life, right? So, but the toads are known more to be land, terrestrial. Most of these have 2 pairs of limbs, as we can see here. They have the arms, limbs, and their feet. Their feet are kind of webbed, you know, so two pairs, and some are legless. We have some legless, as we talked before, but their feet, they have no claws on their feet. You can see all their feet coming up here, their feet and their hands. Don't see any claws at all on there, so no claws. They can do their respiration they have tiny underdeveloped kind of lungs. In their larva stage, they do their respiration through their gills, of course, just like fish do. And then they breathe through their lungs, but most of their respiration is not through their lungs or gills necessarily, but through their skin. So they breathe actually through their skin, which is pretty unique. So we'll be talking a little bit, when we talk about the respiration, we'll be talking about that in a little bit. They all have 3 chambered hearts. Remember, we have a 4-chambered heart, but they have 3 chambers. Their ventricle is underdeveloped there. So, and you'll see that's why they do their respiration through their skin, because it doesn't have really going to the pulmonary blood mixes. But they all have abundant blood vessels. They're poikilotherms. Remember the word poikilotherm, which means cold-blooded. They're cold-blooded, just like reptiles. Some live in the tropics and some live in the temperate, warm areas. They do not like to live in really cold areas, you know, so. And some burrow into the ground to avoid heat. And they do have a process which they call estivate. So what is estivate? Estivate is basically, estivation is when it gets warm, so warm that they just need to lay around to avoid the heat. And then some hibernate in the soil during the cold. They're very good at controlling insects. So frogs are good to have around when you have a lot of insects, because that's what they eat. So they're value to man in that way. You know, some eat other things besides insects, of course, worms and such other things too. But insects are common. They're an insectivore. So let's look here at the anurans. So we're talking about the characteristics over here. There's a word you need to know there in the midst of that is metamorphosis. Metamorphosis is after the eggs hatch, young amphibians usually pass through an aquatic gilled larva stage. The transition of larva into adult, which usually involves major changes in the body, is called metamorphosis. Kind of like the butterflies. Now we have bullfrogs and butterflies, right? I love that song. So let's talk about going on to the anurans specifically, which are frogs. So here we have the anurans are leaping tailless amphibians belonging to the order of Anura, which means without tail, or Salentia, which means leaping. So leaping without tail. So on to frogs, the difference between frogs and toads. Well, of course, frogs are leaping. Let's go into that picture of frog there. You can see some that we were at before, because here we have a toad. See the difference between the toad and the frog, which we're going to talk about. Frogs are leaping, tailless, smooth-skinned, without tail. Toads return to the water only to reproduce. They're mainly land. They have, look at this toad here. They have kind of a warty skin and shorter legs. You know, they're called Buffonidae. Buffonidae is the name for some of the toads. So, and then of course the tree frog there, they live in the trees. Arboreal means living in the trees. And they have the greatest diversity throughout. Actually, the greatest diversity of frogs is in Africa, but they live in all areas of the world except for the North and South Pole. And they don't like to live in the deserts because they dry out, especially extreme deserts. So some of the frogs, we have the Goliath frog, which is huge. It's 1 foot and a 2 foot when you include the whole body. So 1 foot to 2 foot. That's how big those Goliath frogs are. They have protecting covering here, so you can see with the bullfrog, with the camouflage there. Chromatotors means that they control their skin color. So their skin color is controlled by a hormone called melanin, and there's 3 types of chlorotones, so 3 different types of melanin that makes their skin different colors, and it stimulates the pigments in their color, and they can change color. So they use their hind legs to swim. Their hind legs, they have 5 webbed toes on their hind legs, and 4 toes, or call them finger toes, on their fore areas. So let's go on there to the next page. Let's see if we can go on here in the next page and see what we have. Okay, frog skin. We're going to talk about frog skin and other things here, so let's just focus in there. So frogs have toxic skin secretions, and the skin, if you know, is really moist and slippery, and it has this protective mucus covering over it. So here's a mucus gland, as you can see. This is their skin here, and so they have a lot of mucus, and it makes their skin like waterproof. They have the outer layer of skin, the epidermis, contains keratin, and this protects against the loss of water, and it varies through species. They also have poison glands, especially certain ones, and this poison through their skin. Now, this will irritate a lot of times when they're eaten, or someone wants to bite them or eat them. Will cause the predator to be very nauseated and even kill the predator. And we'll talk about the arrow poison frog in just a bit, but that's the poisonous frog. But they have no protection against snakes. Snakes, most of the time snakes can eat them and the poison won't bother them at all, which is pretty unusual. So here we go. Here's down here the capillary and muscle area. We have the dermis layers similar to the epidermis. Now those are layers we have too, but they have this. This is a picture of the poison gland, the mucus gland, the chromatophores. They're the pigment cells that change color from 3 different colors in that green up there, so you can see, and they go by hormones, how they change color. So, and there is let's see, let's go on to the next, see if I can find any more pictures here. So, well, we're going to go on to here in just a little bit, but we're also going to talk about, I thought they had a picture of the poison frog, but there's a poison frog called the arrow poison frog in South America. It's extremely poison. The neurotoxin, not just hemotoxin to do with the blood system, neurals has to do with nerves. So this poison, it will, as it pierced into skin and gets into the blood system, and basically it could kill, like if you take just a tiny bit, only 0.09, ounces of that would kill like 3 million people. That's some poisoned frogs. So what they used to do, the Indians, that they would they would pierce through the skin of the frog back in there. Let me show you where that is, the poison on that again. Let's go back to the poison thing. Poison through there in that poison gland there. And so they pierce through to get that. The Indians would do that, and they'd heat it up to a point to get all of the poison out of there. And they'd put them on their arrows. The Indians back then would put on their arrows and just a little bit on their arrows, and they could shoot at monkeys and birds and deer and jaguar and paralyze them instantly. So it was quite a weapon. And coming from the most poisonous animal, this arrow poison frog. But it must enter the bloodstream, so they had to put it on an arrow. They can't just have the animal eat it, because if the animal eats it in this case, now of course in other cases if they would eat it, they would be sick. But in this case, it has to go into the bloodstream right away, the poison does. And these toxic enzymes paralyze and are neurotoxic right away. Very poison, the most poisonous thing you can imagine. So now let's get back over to this section here. And we're talking about the life cycle of the frog here. So as you can see. So as you go all the way from the eggs, first let's start about how the eggs even get here. So we have the eggs being produced in mass here. So external fertilization means the sperm are put on the eggs after they're sitting there, after they're deposited, and then they're fertilized. It means external fertilization with the sperm. So the female lays the eggs in the water, and then the male comes along and it will fertilize the eggs externally. But it's kind of weird, when she's laying the eggs, they have this process called amplexus. Amplexus means to embrace. And so the male will embrace the female to help her expel those eggs right here. So it's called amplexus. Think of that name. That name, so it squeezes, will squeeze the adult, squeeze the female, and the eggs will come out, and then they'll fertilize the eggs in the water. And these are jelly coated. It takes in laying their eggs, sometimes it can take 10 minutes or longer, and at night or day, and the eggs come, and these eggs are jelly coated eggs. And then the male discharges the sperm over the eggs. And now what are we going to have? We're going to have those tadpoles come out. Anyway, the jelly layer of the eggs, going back to that, is released in the water. They have to have water, and the eggs are all sticking together. They stick together in swells. They're very difficult for predators to get into them because they're so sticky, as the predators don't like them like that. The toads deposit in strings, and frogs in big, huge groups of clusters like that. And especially toads, can attach under leaves, and they anchor this into the vegetation. Then they hatch and they turn into these little tadpoles. The tadpoles drop in the water from the leaves, if they're on leaves or in the water, and they produce these little guys that are swimming around here that look like small little fish-like creatures. So the different times as you go, as it form the gills, it has external gills, goes on to the gill covering forms as you come in here, and here's where the hind legs are starting to develop of the frog. As you come here, the frog still has this long tail, and the forelegs and lungs are developed here during this stage. The frog reabsorbing the tail and functioning lungs comes out of the water there. And then we start the cycle again. So that is the metamorphosis, the life cycle of a frog. So the different types of frogs, going through the different types of frogs, let's see. Well, let's just go over them. There's the white-lipped, has a hole near, basically, deposits eggs near a hole near the pond, and then whips up the eggs into this foam, and it's drawn into the water of the pond. This is called the white-lipped, and it whips up in their whole eggs look like a huge whipping up thing, and then they're transported around. Suriname toad in South America loops to catch the eggs on its back. So it will catch the eggs basically catching the eggs on its back, and then they'll remain on the female's back until instead of laying here, they'll be on the back of the frog and remains in the cavities of the back of the frog. The midwife toad carries the eggs in her hind legs. So these eggs would be in the legs of the frog. These are weird things, weird creatures doing this. The Darwin toad, that's kind of unusual. The male picks with his tongue and carries the eggs in his vocal sac. So carrying the eggs in his vocal sac into the hatch is really weird. Another weird frog. The barking frog and the cliff frog live in the rock cliffs and some in Texas. And the barking frog and the cliff frog have no tadpole stage at all. So, hey, that's unique. So those are some unique frogs. So here's it's all in here. We have the Darwin frog here and down to the cliff frog that doesn't have it, and the midwife frog carrying the eggs in on her hind legs, and the Darwin the males carrying it in their vocal sac. So weird. So the tadpole, the metamorphosis, let's talk about that just a little bit more, what's in your book. Other things about it is, when it starts with the egg and the yolk and it turns to the tadpole, and then it breathes and develops, the gills develop into the lungs. And during this time, this tadpole metamorphosizes. It hatches usually in 6 to 9 days, depending on the temperature. The hind legs will appear first, as in this picture, and then the tail's reabsorbed, and the gills are replaced. And the bullfrog, it usually takes 2 to 3 years. So this process to become a bullfrog would take 2 to 3 years. That's a long time. 2 to 3 years to metamorphosize for the bullfrog. The frogs cannot regenerate injured, lost. Once you're a frog, they can't regenerate parts. But when they're a tadpole, they can, the larva stage, they can regenerate certain parts. If the parts get hurt or get cut off, they can make new during the tadpole. So, well, we're going to get on to the anatomy and physiology of the frog here. That's enough for the development of a tadpole. I think you got it. And then we're going to go on here and we're going to talk about the anatomy of a frog. And we'll do that in the next video.